Hello, welcome everyone. Today I have the great honor to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Louise Buck, who is an old-time friend and colleague of mine. And Louise and I, we go way back. Actually, in the late 90s, early 2000s, we collaborated together doing field research in Madagascar when Louise was working for C4 and with the Cornell International Institute for Food, Agriculture and Development, which was CFAD. I was doing my PhD research on slash and burn systems then, and Louise was working on collaborative, adaptive forest management and also agroforestry, regenerative food systems, etc. So we basically started to get to know each other in the field a long time back. And interestingly, this seminar series was actually the Wednesday noon seminar series was basically started with CFAT about 30 years ago. And Louise was one of the organizers together with Lucy Fisher. And at that time, it was called Perspective in Agroecological Systems. And it has been basically a constant happening or event throughout these 30 years, has had several mutations. But just to say, when we sit here today, it has a long history and has been a lot happening during that time. Louise has spent her career tackling, I think, some of the most complex and pressing development conservation issues. How can we design approaches and implement solutions that address holistically not just one element, conservation of our natural resources, but also strengthening economies and improve livelihoods? And I think Louise has taken a very interesting take on this to kind of tackle these challenges by working at the landscape level. In a very holistic and also inclusive manner throughout her whole career. So to do this work, Louise has been wearing two hats for a long time. She has been a senior extension associate with the Department of Natural Resources and Environment here at CALS at Cornell. And she has also been part of the organization EcoAgriculture Partners, where she has been leading the EcoAgriculture Innovations in Collaborative Landscape Management Program for 17 years. Today, she's a senior advisor to the organization. And with that combination, she was able to bring this really important work to Cornell. And she is coordinated at Cornell, the Cornell EcoAgriculture Group over many years. And she has facilitated many research studies with many faculty members across the university. And she's also provided students with the opportunity to learn, participate, and contribute to those eco-agriculture initiatives. Louise has a PhD from Cornell, master's from Colorado State University, and has done her undergraduate studies at the University of Colorado. And in today's talk, Louise will introduce us to the framework of integrated landscape management, and also introduce us to the recent and highly innovative and collaborative initiative, 1,000 Landscape for 1 billion people. So I'm very excited to learn more about it. Welcome, Louise, and the floor is yours.
So much, Erica. I really appreciate your historical perspective on our relationship, Erica, and the fact that we're really not talking about anything very new here today. It's interesting, if you live long enough, a lot of these ideas, recycle. And I think that's exactly what's happening. Erica and I were working under a framework decades ago, literally, where we were talking about regenerative agriculture. And now it's a new thing again. And so what I'm going to do in today's presentation is weave together a bit of a story. The story will present some challenges. It will introduce some concepts. It will describe a few innovations. It will synthesize a few lessons learned and point to some ways ahead. So we're going to situate ourselves in our age of polycrisis. The present and future risks are interacting with each other to form a cluster of related global risks with compounding effects such that the overall impact exceeds the sum of each part. So says the Future Risk Report of the World Economic Forum in 2023. Many dimensions to this polycrisis. There's an environmental dimension wherein our limits to our planetary boundaries are crossing planetary boundaries. It's ever increasing. It has a climate dimension wherein CO2 emissions are ever increasing. It has a socioeconomic dimension wherein the wealth gap between the richest and the poorest people and countries is ever increasing, where social unrest is also increasing, and where confidence and trust in our political institutions is ever decreasing. And this analysis was put together by a group called Bounce Beyond, which identifies as a so-called transformation catalyst. And Bounce Beyond has had an important influence on the initiative that I'm going to describe to you today. They're trying to get people to recognize that we're not dealing with, incremental needs for incremental change. We're dealing with the fact that we need to really think about transforming entire systems, and that's no small task. So the stories about these interconnected global challenges of poverty, ecosystem degradation, unsustainable economies, and our climate crisis, and how integrated landscape solutions might be part of the way of addressing these challenges. The goal of integrated landscape solutions is to secure local livelihoods, provide for healthy nature, to stimulate thriving local economies, and to present solutions to climate change. Let me introduce a couple of key concepts that we'll need to have in mind as we carry on with our story. We define a landscape as a socio-ecological area including interconnected natural and human-altered lands and waters that are shaped by history and nature and culture. And this term of integrated landscapes is analogous to over 100 other terms that we've documented. And I'm provided a few references here, and at the end there is a list of references to all these documents. So I'm going to go quickly through this stuff and assume if you want more information, you'll get it yourself. But the main concept here is that integrated landscapes are also known as seascapes, territories, bioregions, watersheds, jurisdictions. It's really about operating planning and management systems in, quote, localities. And we'll learn more about what that means as we go through. By a landscape partnership, we're talking about coalitions of people and organizations across sectors and communities who work over the long term toward resilient, sustainable development and ecosystem regeneration. Very importantly, guided by their shared vision for the landscape. Between 2011 and 2020, EcoAgriculture partners organized and mobilized some 45 different partners to through the so-called Landscapes for People, Food, and Nature People, Food, and Nature initiative to study landscape initiatives and to better understand them through a whole range of different kinds of studies across the globe that use different entry points to examine the potential for landscape approaches to solving dimensions of our polycrisis. And we also hosted a whole range of dialogues at different levels, very local, regional, national, and a number of international dialogues. And we synthesized the many knowledge products and studies and dialogues that we facilitated during that decade into what we called the Global Review for Integrated Landscape Management. And I've documented how you can get that information about the Global Review. Very importantly, the Cornell EcoAgriculture Working Group was instrumental in doing many of these studies, conducting a lot of this work. And we had a host of faculty members from a variety of different departments who were engaged. and many different students from all levels. We had senior honors thesis students, we had MPS students, MS students, we had quite a few PhDs, all of whom contributed, even had Humphrey Fellows, to this global review to help us understand better what is the potential for integrated landscape management to deal with what we're now calling dimensions of our polycrisis. And we found in that work enormous proliferation of landscape initiatives constantly during that decade. Very strong foundations for landscape approaches from diverse entry points. So biodiversity conservation people, climate change professionals and practitioners, rural development professionals and practitioners, and of course agriculture, and particularly those involved in what we call agroecological or regenerative agricultural practices had played a key role in many of these studies. And in order to help us understand what we need in terms of innovation to help inspire people to practice ILM, because I'm having a hard time with this light, but I'm going to go over here for a minute. The innovation systems for practicing adaptive collaborative management, we conceptualized as including the stakeholders involved, the desirable practice, the learning to support the practice, the facilitation to support the learning, and the institutional support framework, as well as the conducive policy context. The point in putting this together is to help us recognize the types of knowledge, information, and learning, and how we organize to produce knowledge, and how we synthesize information is rooted in the process that we refer to as social learning. It's group learning, it's collaborative learning, and it's more consistent with dealing with multi-sector, multidisciplinary approaches. The idea is to draw on multiple sources of knowledge and information, and to set up learning systems so that you capture the best ideas from all the different perspectives that one gets if you invest in group learning. Nowadays, that's becoming relatively common practice. 10 or 15 years ago, it wasn't. This was relatively new and kind of innovative itself. And so the point is of having a framework like this is to look for consistency in how you're trying to conceptualize the desirable practice, i.e. integrated landscape management, and the learning and the facilitation and the institutional support that are needed. And it boils down to, multi. You're dealing with lots of people, lots of ideas, and the challenge is to help synthesize it in a way that actually helps drive action forward. Some lessons learned from the LPFN. These are just a few of the key lessons. If you refer to some of these documents that I've cited here, you'll learn a lot more. But we concluded that ILM fosters collaboration across sectors, scales, and actors to operationalize the concept of landscape approaches. So landscape approaches is a very broad concept. A lot of the scientific literature that comes out about landscapes and integrated landscapes is actually you'll find it more under landscape approaches literature than ILM approaches. But what we found through LPFN is that ILM helps to operationalize and figure out how you can improve the practice of landscape approaches. Landscape approaches at that time especially, the writing was all extremely theoretical, and some principles of landscape management were synthesized, but the how-tos were really left out of a lot of that work. So it was relatively important step to start talking about how you operationalize landscape approaches. I want to focus on ILM being an effective scaling strategy for scaling up agroecological practices. As Erica mentioned, in my early years, I was very interested in agroforestry, and I had a formative experience in rural Kenya, where just almost by accident, We had some stunning successes in agroforestry, catching on across huge swaths of the landscape, across many districts. And there's a number of reasons it's been evaluated as to why that happened. But I attribute a lot of it to the fact that when I was leading these programs, I honestly didn't know anything about what I was doing. I was very, very curious. I asked a lot of questions. I listened a lot. And in that process, I managed to surround myself with women's groups and local political leaders and church leaders and a lot of other local organizations who were fascinated by this concept of agroforestry and had a tremendous amount of knowledge and information to share about it. And so we got funding from a number of organizations, including the World Agroforestry Center and CARE and others, to meet certain targets for how we would get agroforestry adopted. And all our targets were exceeded by tenfold, by even more. And so development practitioners would come to us and say, you know, how did you do it? And basically our formula was, you listen and you learn and you try and you implement the ideas that seem to make sense, and you don't implement the ideas that nobody's interested in. And it sounds so common sense now, but in those days when participatory rural development was just beginning, it was revolutionary. And so that whole idea of how can we, I recognize that agroforestry had a lot of potential, but not if you limit it to adoption on particular farms. They all had to connect, all these systems, across landscapes. So we were able to accomplish that by wildly exceeding our so-called adoption targets. And then we reconceptualized what we were doing. We're not really talking so much about adoption as we're talking about collaborative learning and trying and planning. And it really requires thinking about innovation systems at a slightly higher scale. So I became really interested in how we can take a particular agroforestry project and scale it up through agroforestry. And we had a number of classes here through the Department of Natural Resources. And we did research in the Andes and in the Amazon regions of Ecuador. And eventually we had a number of publications in sustainability science. And so now we have kind of a formula, if you will, a strategy for how you can apply ILM to scale up agroforestry. It's no longer seat of the pants, oh my gosh, how did that happen? It's much more deliberate now, and we can make some conclusions about how others might employ that approach and have similar kinds of results. Our final lesson learned is that coalitions of landscape champions are what's needed to accelerate the effort. Even though ILM is catching on and there's more and more practice, it's still nowhere near realizing its potential for addressing the issues that we mentioned that our polycrisis represents. So how can we take this exciting practice and help more landscapes reap the benefits of the practice of integrated landscape management? So we decided that coalitions of landscape champions need to accelerate the effort. We recognize a few systemic barriers to LP success, that they're highly fragmented. The support for them is highly fragmented. They have limited access to tools and services. Essentially, they've been bypassed by the IT and data revolution, that local priorities are often ignored by policymakers, and that there's basically inadequate funding for landscape partnerships, investment, and services. So thus was born the 1,000 Landscapes for 1 Billion People initiative. A number of those involved in the LPFN and other organizations that the LPFN activity influenced came together. Those initial organizations that were involved in this initiative are listed here. The most notable for me is Tech Matters. So you recognize most of these as sort of conservation and sustainable development organizations that are that you'd expect to see in an alliance like this. Tech Matters is a group that came out of Silicon Valley that call themselves a member of a coalition that strives to apply, quote, tech for good. So they're people who made their fortunes in the tech industry and then turned around and said, okay, we don't need to worry about livelihood security anymore. How can we apply what we've learned about how to develop disruptive technologies to environmental conservation and sustainable development? So Tech Matters was a leader in this work. We didn't know it at the time, but they had sent representatives of their group to some of our dialogues and some of our conferences and learning events within LPFN. They got wind of what we were doing and they came to us and said, how can we join? We think we have a lot to share, a lot that you can learn from. And that is indeed the case. We learned so much from interacting with the tech industry. So we said, if we want a powerful support system for landscape partnerships, we better build it. Who better than that group? Well, these are the organizations that, you know, a couple of years later, I'm not sure exactly how long it took us to have all these partners sign up for our so-called radical collaboration. It's grown considerably since then, and when I get further along in my story, you'll recognize some of the impetus for the further growth. But this was in 2020. These were all of our partners that had signed on to the 1,000 Landscapes for a Billion People that was being coordinated by those 5 organizations that I mentioned. And very importantly was our financial supporters. So this is a collection, the financial supporters, they work sort of as a group, and they're led by the IKEA Foundation. And the IKEA Foundation got wind of what we were doing, and they said, we're talking about generational change. We recognize that a big part of why the projects that we fund cannot lead directly to generational change is these very short rotation project cycles. We're all familiar with them. You get 2 or 3 years of funding. If you do a really good job and you've got really generous progressive donors, you might eke out 5 years. And then you have to send in your final reports. Your final reports are full of these amazing outputs. You've just generated so much stuff. But when it comes to outcomes and how you've really changed behavior and changed land use systems and changed the paradigm from extractive to sustainable and so on, you need a lot longer. IKEA Foundation, somehow, I don't know enough about the background of that organization, they're Dutch-based. They said, you know, we get it. We don't want to keep behaving that way. We have our hands tied too. Let us lead a consortium of donors that actually tries to disrupt that practice. And that means co-designing with us. Let us be part of your conceptualization meetings, you're designing your initiative meetings, and we will let you know if we and these other donors that we hope to influence can support that. And if not, we'll try to help you change course so that it does become, you know, financially viable. So this is really quite a breakthrough in my experience. And IKEA, of course, is still very active with us. And hopefully they will be for at least a generation. Okay, so that happened in 2019 was the inception phase. Between 2020 and 2024 June, very recently, we've been involved in the design, testing, and demonstration phase of the LPFN. And we organized ourselves according to a number of design teams. Again, we were influenced by the Tech Matters group and by this concept of radical collaboration. Radical collaboration, the tagline for that is leave your logos and your egos at the door. Well, we're not very good at leaving our logos at the door, but we try really hard to leave our egos at the door, meaning we're trying to figure out how, instead of competing for recognition and for access to donors, and the other rewards that come with, conventional professional success, how can we look instead at what we actually were able to accomplish by working together and by sharing knowledge and information and not worried so much about credit for ourselves and our organizations, but keeping our eye on the ball of the longer term. Naturally, there's all kinds of trade-offs and concerns. If I were still building my career, I would have been a little nervous signing on to that because it was really important for me to have, name recognition on publications and teaching and all the rest that comes with awards in the academic system and in the professional system in general. Anyway, a lot could be said about that, but it has really made a big difference in how I've been able to work since we bought onto this idea of bringing the best ideas to the fore and shifting leadership, constantly, having a model of shared leadership, but bringing different leaders in who need to be part of the challenge of the moment. So we do very short rotation innovations. We come up with an idea, we work in our design team to elaborate it, we test it, we try it, we evaluate it, and then we either apply it or we toss it out or adapt it again. Very short rotation. You don't wait for a whole semester or a year, let alone, several years to do this. It's within weeks, months, and maybe, a few months where we're, capturing our lessons learned, figuring out what to do next and so on. It's a pretty different way of working. So the hub, there's the hub. Oh, sorry. I just want my little pointer. Oh, okay. I should have practiced, sorry. Oh, well, forget it. You guys can see the hub. The hub was the group of core partners that provided the coordination and the interface with the donors, and also facilitated the process of bringing in new partners. And the rest of us worked in design teams, and I co-led the capacity strengthening design team for quite a while, and I always shared the leadership with others and other organizations that were part of 1000L, and I let go of that role about a year ago now, but those who I shared leadership with helped mentor my replacement at EcoAgriculture Partners, and now she's kind of the main lead for capacity strengthening. The Terrasso digital platform is the work that Tech Matters was leading, and the Landscape Finance Solutions had a separate design team. I'm going to say very, very little of anything about that in this presentation because it's really a very distinct set of activities that I honestly don't know very much about. Our design team members in there consist of many so-called intermediaries. Those are actors within the larger global finance system and the conservation finance system who are creating, quote, new mechanisms for financing landscape initiatives over the long term. And it's an entire body of work. And if you Google any of these organizations that are part of, essentially just Google 1000 landscapes for a billion people and look up finance design team, and you'll learn a lot about what we're doing in that space. But another piece of what we were doing in capacity strengthening was helping support the development of national coalitions of landscape partnerships. So we recognized that for landscape partnerships to really start to empower themselves, they need to link. They benefit a great deal by linking with other landscape partnerships. And in Kenya, there was a tremendous opportunity to do that as this initiative got off the ground, owing to our East Africa landscape learning network that we developed during LPFN. So it was a very ripe opportunity, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. So 1000 Landscapes vision For thriving landscapes, focuses on the who, that's the multi-stakeholder partnerships and platforms. The what is the for returns or benefits or outcomes that each landscape initiative aspires to. Inspiration for the next generation is considered a equally important outcome as the other more tangible outcomes. Where, across all land uses, how, the 5 elements of ILM are listed here. I'll give you another shot of those in a second. And then again, we're looking at this long-term 20-year generational time frame before you can really expect to get all of the benefits. The how, these are the 5 elements of ILM. These were identified during the LPFN days, and we put them together under the concept of adaptive collaborative management. And it involves, first of all, forming your partnership, helping the partnership develop a shared understanding of their landscape, vision and planning, taking action, learning and impact, and so on. The value of this framework is aligning all of these different actors around a common framework so that we can all be heading in the same direction, even though we're innovating to solve our immediate needs in our own spaces. During the design, testing, and demonstration phase, we did in-depth, detailed co-design with the landscape partnerships that are listed here. These are all landscape partnerships that we were intimately familiar with because they were part of the orbit of some of the founding organizations, and we didn't have to invest in developing new relationships. We wanted to focus on investing in new, what we call tools and services. The capacity strengthening design team members, there were members from all of the founding organizations originally. Over time, some self-selected to play a very major role, a few self-selected to get out and focus their energy elsewhere. But during our early days, we co-created this framework for identifying, the activities, the progression of activities that we would undertake. And on the left, we characterize some of the process elements that would affect how we would work together. An early important output was the Practical Guide to Integrated Landscape Management, which was accompanied by a so-called tool guide, and this explained the how-tos to new landscape initiatives or to any who wanted to benefit from our synthesis of all of the kinds of tools that could be applied to help landscape initiatives undertake their work. So the learning resources, we're developing learning modules that correspond with all of these activities and outputs. And the foundational modules have to do mainly with shifting mindsets. They're considered cross-cutting competencies in order to take action around landscape approaches. The Kenya Landscape Actors Platform, known as KenLAP, was developed at the same time. And next week, in early November, this very innovative and impactful group is having their first big conference in Nairobi, and it's being quite widely publicized, or at least it's coming in a lot of my feeds. I'm really proud of these guys for being able to communicate so well what they're doing, and they're influencing government policy in Kenya to support this whole coalition of LPs and to get better, more secure funding for them. So overall, our achievements involve so far, as of half a year ago, actually, 40 partners working together, so on. You can read this. I don't want to spend any more time on it, but enough to satisfy IKEA and then some. In other words, they're very satisfied so far with the kinds of knowledge products and the kinds of relationships we've been able to develop, and they're continuing to work with us to get into the scaling phase. A few lessons learned from our design, testing, and demonstration phase basically boils down to the constant effort of collaboration and relationship building is really paying off. Our learning modules, which we're testing with many landscapes across the globe with kind of a concentration in Kenya, in many different modes, some online, some with more complex learning systems, some very hands-on and just face-to-face. they're working. We're able to develop materials that the landscapes like, and they come back for more and ask for more. So now we're moving forward. We're in early 2024 into how we can demonstrate and test scaling pathways. And we've modified our innovation system so that now we're talking about scaling ILM, just not only implementing ILM, but how do we scale it? And the main stakeholders involved are the landscape partnerships. And so we've modified the kinds of activities that are needed for the innovation systems to foster scaling. And now we are presented with a targeted scaling challenge for ILM and 1000L to help make our food systems work for humanity and nature. And you've heard this, you've been exposed to this list of issues with our food system in other seminars this semester, so I won't go into that. But this is the group of donors and key actors known as Regen 10 that have challenged us to help apply integrated landscape management toward regenerative food systems, which they define as embracing holistic, equitable approach to food production, distribution, and consumption that centers on bountiful nutrition for society while actively improving ecological and health and climate. So how can we apply collaborative landscape management to basically help facilitate regenerative food system transformation? Well, we can do that by bundling these approaches that we've been piloting and that we find, works fairly well so far. And now we're tasked with the question, what will it take to catalyze landscape action for regenerative food systems? And we propose that action research is an especially catalytic set of activities in terms of helping landscape partnerships conceptualize and operationalize how they can apply what they're doing to help transition toward regenerative food systems. So we propose that action researchers elaborate, contextualize, and evaluate the following propositions. First, that agroecological farming and green infrastructure are prevalent land uses. We know from prior seminars, just even this semester, something about what agroecological farming and ecological infrastructure is. These are some examples of what we mean by regenerative agriculture, agroforestry, integrated pest management, reduced tillage, cover cropping, and so on. Two very excellent seminars that we had this semester helped us understand two important regenerative agriculture practices in more depth. That is the system of rice intensification and cereal species mixtures. Second proposition that we suggest we put to the test through action research is landscape partnerships and their shared vision for change can powerfully influence food system actors to invest in regeneration through all of these activities. A third is that strong landscape partnerships include leadership from the food system. So we ask, what are critical roles for farmers and farmer groups, for farmers markets, for food policy councils, and so on? And what will incentivize them to engage in landscape partnerships and to invest in them? Fourth proposition, that engaging communication builds trust and inspires collaborative action. There's a whole range of different communication products and strategies that we've been testing in 1000L, and we haven't done much yet so far with farmers and consumers and other actors in the food system itself. So we need to bring those key actors into our communication materials. LPs can foster regenerative businesses. Strong landscape partnerships can facilitate product sourcing by external value chain actors that lead to business opportunities for local entrepreneurs. So we propose that landscape partnerships can help influence what happens at each stage of the food chain by basically turning often exploitive types of relationships between sourcing companies that come to a landscape to get different products, how can landscape partnerships help modify the behavior of those companies and influence them to reinvest in companies within the landscape? LPs can link local and global food systems. Strong LPs help to stimulate robust global and local markets for regeneratively produced farm products and foster a vibrant, inclusive economy. Regenerative outcome frameworks drive monitoring, evaluation, and learning by examining intersections between farm and landscape level activity. So we're working with Regen 10 to develop an outcome framework. And we're asking now, how can action researchers help us help landscape partnerships choose the right metrics, figure out cost-effective ways to measure them, focusing on what we call integrative indicators, such as soil health and inclusion. In turn, food system transformation, once we start to make the shift towards more viable, holistic food systems, we propose that they, in turn, can power regenerative landscapes across all the major land uses. So that there's a really important intersection and interaction that the food system, the landscape partnership can influence the food system in the ways that I've just proposed. And in turn, the food system changing stands to generate many other benefits within the landscape. Regenerative landscape action researchers in turn stimulate LP innovation. We propose that land action researchers, including monitoring and evaluation specialists who use community-engaged methods, can help build understanding and motivate further action by landscape partnerships. And finally, that action research strengthens capacities of LPs to accelerate food system transformation. By engaging in critical reflection, inspiring learning and research specialists to join or support LPs, and generating ideas for new learning modules, and broadening what we refer to as the ILM user journey in using these modules and services that we've been producing. So I asked the question at the end here, can you envision yourself engaged in action research on landscape collaboration for regenerative food systems? And I add a couple of caveats as you think about this. First, landscape partnerships and integrated landscape approaches are not necessarily the best solution in all cases. There's a high transaction cost. There's a lot of interaction that's needed in order to bring multi-sectors and multi-disciplines together and to make decisions and to decide on what to do. And certainly funding is, even though we're starting to figure out, alternative funding strategies, maybe, it's an expensive way to go. If you're living and belonging and feeling place attachment and recognize the social capital and are able to be part of inspiring collaborative action in a particular landscape without having to form a landscape partnership, do it. In other words, where we're talking about these situations applying where there's basically contested issues, where there's some kind of a conflict, where you can't meet your goals for whatever they are, for food security and for nature conservation alone without collaborating with others. So we're not proposing this as a universally applicable situation. We're proposing it as in an area where there is some kind of conflict and tension over getting all of these different outcomes from particular sets of land use. And I also, well, that's enough. Okay. I want to acknowledge and appreciate the 1000 L Capacity Strengthening Design Team for its camaraderie, creativity, and expertise. John Recha is the person who is behind ChenLab. He did his PhD here at Cornell back, he was here for almost 5 years in crop and soil science and has been a real mover and shaker in this whole landscape set of activities, and he's an expert facilitator. The EcoAgriculture Partners team, who I've been working with for a long time now. And I also want to call out Professors James Lasoy and Norman Uphoff, as well as Rich Stedman, who I've had the opportunity to work with over the years, and who both regarding what I've learned from them, but also their support of some pretty, non-conventional institutional arrangements that allow for a lot of this work to happen. They've really promoted a creative approach to thinking about how we can use the institutions here at Cornell and the knowledge and the talent that we have at Cornell to apply them to really important real-world problems, even though it's a little bit complex to do that sometimes. So thank you. These are my references if you want to take a look at this presentation again and learn more about what we're talking about. But in the meantime, I would like you to think about, what it means. Action research, of course, can mean many different things. There's many different levels of rigor that are applied to action research. Last week's seminar by the World Food Prize winner exemplified an exceptional type of action research. The type we're talking about here is going to be a little bit less intensive and a little bit less expensive, but it still stands to make a really large impact in how we can move this this transition towards more regenerative food systems forward.
Thank you so much, Louise. Thank you so much, Louise. And I think all the tools, methods, guide, manuals, etc. I would encourage for anybody to actually go and really look at those and see how they can be applied to their own work, even if you're not part of a of a big landscapes program. So, any questions, comments? That are you?
Hi, Louise. Thanks for
Hi,
sharing
thank
the
you.
great history of the project. It's great to learn a little bit more about it. I'm curious about to what extent you guys have explored the kinds of, I guess, local and regional institutions that either need to be in place to help things along or potentially need to be seeded or brought together, created for the best outcomes that you've seen across these projects. Is there a particular, I don't know, role or archetype of certain kinds of institutions that are necessary as players in this?
Thank you. Great question. There's, of course, a tremendous variation in institutional requirements for this kind of work. And usually it's weak institutional context in which calls for more deliberate efforts to bring landscape partnerships together to overcome some of those weaknesses. Some of the most influential, powerful local institutional arrangements are in areas that where the subnational government entities are already working at what they often call a territorial approach. So it's where there is institutional support and at least usually some kind of legislation and tradition of practicing planning at the very local level. And then the challenge is just to bring in multiple sectors. Usually that kind of planning is very single sector on its own. So bringing in multiple sectors isn't a huge challenge to overcome compared to inventing a whole new governance system. So I really think that's usually an excellent starting point, is figuring out who are the local planning entities, which ministries, which sectors have them. And often, like in our area, I mean, in the US, counties are often a good place to work on this. We don't need these institutions as much as they're needed in other places. And so, and not everyone deals with counties. In Kenya, it's usually sub-districts. But it's really important to look at, where this kind of work is already happening, and that is of spatial planning, and then help bring other institutional actors inside what's already strong.
Hi, thanks, Louise. Fascinating, great work. I love it, every minute of it. So my question is, you ended kind of talking about the conflicts that make it suitable to use this approach almost,
Yes.
is the way I heard it. So what I'm gonna, and you have what appears to me like a very broad and diverse group of types of organizations and presumably individuals who are involved. And the thing that you passed over rather quickly, I wonder if you could address more, was the idea of shared understandings and shared theories of change.
Yeah.
And could you just talk, because like a lot of groups and organizations don't even have an explicit theory of change.
That's right.
So I wonder if you could talk a little more about how you together sort of evolved towards both highlighting that and then trying to achieve it.
Well, that is such a great question. You know, the reason I skipped over it is it's very complex and I have so much to say about it. I knew I would run out of time if I went there. It is a really fundamental piece of what we're doing. And that is the shared theories of change. So conventional theories of change that most donors support their grantees to produce, as you're well aware, are so-called log frames. And the log frame approach, I'm going to contrast that to what the kinds of theories of change that are really meaningful and actionable are what we call root causal diagrams. Now, those are not new. I was working on root causal diagramming with CARE back in the 80s, but they're really, really important for bringing about that shared understanding, trying to figure out, you have to assess where you are now as a group, make sure everybody's sort of on board before we can go ahead. And then when you go through the causal diagramming, looking at the issues that affect your ability or lack of ability to bring about the main desired outcomes, there's so much self-discovery that goes on. These processes can take quite a long time, but they pay off huge dividends. Because once you come out of one of those processes, and usually it takes days, weeks, it can even take months, then you basically say, yeah, we're on the same page, we get it. You have to negotiate understandings and make sure that it's a really complex process. You've got language barriers, not only cultural language, but professional language. You've got this whole thing about territoriality. If I prevail, then I get to be the leader of this thing, and then my organization wins, and professionally I win. So it's a long negotiation process, but the payoff is huge. And I had the opportunity in the last half year to review 2 papers that C4 and the ECROF C4 group are developing, where they're trying to really dive in to analyzing this process of developing a theory of change that works and that will stick and that will guide a landscape initiative for 20 years. And it's a very important cutting edge area of work, but I'm convinced it's worth the effort.
Well, I think there's one question about that. I think, are we running out of time?
We're out of time, but people are very free to leave.
All right,
You can
Thank
come
you all.
up here.
thank you, Louise.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks for being here. Thanks for listening.